Social distancing has hopefully been helping slow the spread of this pandemic, but we also know it's also caused a lot of discomfort. Now, I'm a bit more of an introvert and a homebody, so the stay-at-home orders at first didn't seem too bad, but I've started to notice that I'm missing something. You know, my social skills, not great to begin with, haven't been getting any exercise. It's hard for me to think and care well for others when I just don't see them. I know all relationships take a lot of work, but I can feel myself losing the practical skills of relating to people and developing friendships. But when I, turn on the radio or listen to the news or engage with what's going on in the world, it can be really discouraging just to see the wide variety of opinions and the way that people don't listen to each other. There are some really hard divisions in our society, and I wonder if it's worth sometimes even trying to get involved. Everyone seems to have an idea of how things should be, but few agree and few listen to each other. How can we come out of this isolated living situation and enter a world marked with so much division and voices that seem to be at odds with one another? For many, the church is a prime example of this, just another voice yelling at how people should live and what they should do. We talked last week about how Christianity is all about having a relationship with God. God is our Father, loving and caring for us, causing us to grow and to flourish. But what does that look like when we interact with other people? How does a relationship with God shape the way that we relate to those around us? Philippians chapter 3 might be one of my favorite chapters in the book of Philippians. I love the down-to-earth nature of how the Apostle Paul talks about life as a Christian. He takes head on the fact that people have disagreements about what to believe about God. If you're familiar with the church, you probably know that there's not a lot of uniformity behind belief and practice. Christians, like all humans, struggle to maintain healthy relationships and sometimes wind up breaking up. Yet relationships are important, even though we have to work through the difficulties that they bring. And that's what the Apostle Paul talks about in this chapter. Throughout his life, the Apostle Paul struggled with a group of people who were really dogmatic and legalistic about what was the proper and necessary behavior for those who follow God. In Paul's day, the friction point that caused the most controversy within the church surrounded the Jewish rite of circumcision. This teaching that the Jewish sign of being set apart for God was absolutely necessary to truly be a follower of God. Paul addresses this controversy throughout his writings, and we see him doing so again here in Philippians chapter 3. Instead of trying to placate and appease and just make sure everybody's happy, Paul actually insults those who teach that circumcision is necessary. Paul says that these people are dogs, not a wholly unfamiliar derogatory sentiment in English, and he also calls them evil. But he doesn't just insult them because he thinks that he's better than them. He talks this way about their belief because it's one that he himself had shared for many years. Paul goes on to talk about how he himself had done everything and thought everything that these people did and was even more extreme than them. He had jumped through all the hoops and done all the work and was the best him that he could be. And he calls all this worthless. And more than worthless, actually. One translation renders verse 8 where Paul talks about this as saying butt rubbish, which is a great homophone for what the Greek actually says. We actually do real harm, and we're being quite foul if we make Christianity into anything other than God's free gift of salvation through Jesus Christ that brings us into a relationship with Him. And a relationship isn't transactional, at least not a healthy relationship. It takes time, and there's growth and development, which isn't always easy. And part of that growth and development comes about through gathering together as a group. You get to know your friends and even your significant other better by seeing how they interact with other people. And people get to know you by seeing how you interact with other people. And that's true for the Christian faith as well, and for our relationship with God. God as our Father makes us brothers and sisters, able to help and support one another, even if at times we get on each other's nerves. As you read Philippians, that fraternity that the Apostle Paul had with fellow believers pops up everywhere. In chapter 3, he links this with the centrality of God's role in defining Christianity in verse 15, where he says, "Let us therefore, as many as are perfect, have this attitude, and if in anything you have a different attitude, God will reveal that also to you." He goes on to describe how we can grow closer to God through observing and following the pattern of other believers, the way that they live, especially those who are more mature. Now, he does this with a warning. We can't just look at how people live and pattern ourselves after that. But one way that God does help us grow is through helpers and teachers, friends and family, coming together as a group to point each other towards God. Christianity is rooted in that relationship with God that is then lived out in all of our interactions with the rest of the world. Now, there's a lot to be learned from Philippians chapter 3, and so I'd invite you to study it with me this week. Let's look at this chapter and see how God leads us to grow in our relationship with Him. You can follow along with the reading plan and study questions that are in the video description. As we continue to have stay-at-home orders and live with social distancing, do feel free to share your thoughts or your questions in the comments section. It's not as ideal as having a face-to-face conversation about this, but it is one way we can put into practice what we're learning about encouraging one another and pointing each other to God. And so again, I would invite you to join me in studying and looking at Philippians chapter 3 this week.